In myth and in folklore, desire, power and identity are never fixed, and queer women have always existed in the liminal spaces between them. This episode traces the presence of lesbian and sapphic figures across cultures and centuries, exploring how their stories reveal not just who they were, but how queerness has always shaped the narratives we live by. Hello and welcome back to Ladies of Lore, the podcast where we take all of the most wonderful women of mythology and folklore and we unpick, unravel and explore their origins, their stories and how they've changed through time to arrive in today's modern world. I'm India and I'm so grateful to have you here with me today. I hope you're all doing well. If you're new to the podcast, welcome on in. I really hope that you enjoy it here, and if you do, please feel free to subscribe or follow on your favourite podcast platform, and you can also find me over on Blue Sky and TikTok and on the Ladies of Lore Patreon and Discord, which is all in the links in the show notes. I hope you're all doing well. I personally have got a bit of a cold, so I do apologise if I sound unwell. It's because I am, but also I don't want to let you guys down. So we are cracking on. And can you believe it's June? We're actually halfway through the year of 2025, and even more unbelievable to me is that we are so close to one whole year of Ladies of Lore now, which is truly blowing my little brain. Maybe in August I will get myself a little cake or something to celebrate. Anyway, I am so excited to talk about the topic of this week's episode. As we know, June is Pride Month, and as a very proud queer woman, I think it's only right that we have a little chat about queer women in mythology and folklore. But before I do, I just wanted to say a little something that's on a little bit more of a serious note, but it is important. I feel it's important for me to say something. As I record this, the streets of Los Angeles are witnessing a rise in fear and injustice. ICE raids are escalating, targeting immigrant communities with aggression and dehumanisation. Families are being torn apart and lives are being disrupted by a system rooted in cruelty and control. I just want to be absolutely clear that I am firmly and unapologetically against ICE. I believe in sanctuary, I believe in solidarity, and I truly believe in the right of every single person to live free from fear, especially in a city built on the stories and labour of immigrants where many of my loved ones live. So you might be wondering, India, why you got a vested interest in this? Well, many of my loved ones live in Los Angeles, have Mexican heritage, and yeah, it means a lot to me. And this podcast is about myth and it's about memory, but it's also about power and it's also about resistance and it's about reclaiming our voices. So in that spirit, I wanted to make it known that I stand with all those resisting deportation and demanding justice and fighting for a future where love and liberation, not surveillance and fear, shape our communities. And I'll be including some links in the show notes for ways that you can help and support those who are struggling with these issues right now. I know that was a little bit of a departure from the topic of today's episode, but with the tiny little platform that I have, I felt it's only right to say something. So that's my little something. But now let's get back to the topic of today's episode. And there's a really powerful line that sets the tone perfectly for this whole episode. And it goes like this. Without stories, without models, a woman's discovery that she loves another woman may be bewildering and frightening. For centuries, lesbian love has been left without mythic mirrors, rarely portrayed, often erased, sometimes twisted into something monstrous or pitiful. But mythology, as Downing shows, still offers glimmers, reflections of lesbian longing, sisterhood, eroticism and strength. So today, we're tracing that thread. And we're going to go from ancient Greek myths and goddesses to the lyric whispers of Sappho to Amazon warriors and love-struck girls turned into boys. And it will be a little bit different to the regular format because we're going to jump from place and time to place and time and talk about my favourite topic, lesbians. Are you ready? Let's go. In the vast mythological tradition of the Greco-Roman world, few stories so poignantly capture the emotional intensity, isolation and complexity of same-sex desire as the tale of Iphis and Ianthe. And it comes to us from Ovid's Metamorphosis, and though often remembered as a story of divine transformation and miraculous love, it's in truth a lot more layered and emotionally rich, especially when you view it through a queer lens. Beneath its surface lies a struggle with gender identity and a portrait of forbidden love, and a sobering reflection of a world that could only imagine fulfillment for two women in love if one of them ceased to be a woman. And the story begins on the island of Crete, with a poor but earnest couple, Lygdus and Telethusa. And as they await the birth of their very first child, Lygdus delivers a devastating ultimatum to his wife. If the baby is a boy, they will raise him. But if it's a girl, she must be exposed and abandoned at birth to die. This heart-wrenching command was not that uncommon in antiquity, particularly for impoverished families who saw daughters as economic liabilities. And what makes this moment especially jarring is that Lygdus expresses the order with tears in his eyes, not with cruelty, but with the firm resolve of someone crushed by social reality. He weeps, yet he insists. His wife is broken by the command, but powerless to defy him, at least not alone. And it's in this moment of crisis that the story's first miracle occurs. The goddess Isis, an Egyptian deity associated with fertility, healing, and the protection of women, appears to Telethusa in a dream. And she comes to her radiant, surrounded by sacred symbols, and assures the desperate woman that all will be well. The goddess instructs her not to fear and not to obey her husband's command. If the child is a girl, she must conceal the truth and raise her as a boy. Encouraged by this divine intervention, Telethusa does just that. And when the child is born and revealed to be a girl, she names her Iphis, a name chosen precisely because it is gender ambiguous. In both Latin and Greek, it could be a name for a male or a female child, allowing Telethusa to maintain the illusion before her husband and her community. Iphis grows up as a boy, unaware of the secret surrounding her birth. By all appearances, she's indistinguishable from other boys. She's intelligent and strong and admired by her peers. Her father is proud. Her mother watches in quiet anguish, knowing that the secret cannot be kept forever. As Iphis approaches adolescence, her father arranges a marriage for his son to a beautiful young girl named Ianthe, the daughter of a noble Cretan family. Ianthe and Iphis had been childhood companions, educated together, and over the years, a deep affection had blossomed between them. Ianthe is thrilled to marry the boy that she loves, but for Iphis, the prospect of a wedding is not joyous. It's terrifying. At this moment, Ovid grants Iphis an extended interior monologue, one of the most poignant expressions of same-sex desire in classical literature. She stands at the crossroads of her identity. She's caught between the role that she's been forced to play and the desire that she cannot repress. Iphis speaks with emotional clarity, confusion, and desperation. She does not condemn her feelings, but she is shattered by the impossibility of acting on them in a world that she inhabits. A girl myself, I am in love with a girl. And this, they say, is monstrous, unheard of, unnatural. No one has loved as I do, with no hope of fulfillment. She would not refuse me, but I am not what she believes me to be. There is no strict father to keep us apart. There is no scandal in our love, except that I am not a man. This monologue is not simply a cry of despair, it's also a rare and radical articulation of female same-sex desire in antiquity. Ovid doesn't mock or dismiss Iphis, he gives her eloquence and legitimacy even as he traps her within a mythic system that cannot offer her any path forward as a girl who loves another girl. Iphis recognises that her desire is reciprocated, but she's tormented by the knowledge that there is no model, no myth, no social script that can allow it to be fulfilled. At this point in the narrative, Telethusa also reaches her breaking point. She cannot allow the wedding to proceed without divine help, knowing her child's secret will soon be revealed. So she takes Iphis to the temple of Isis, the same goddess who appeared to her years earlier. And in a moment of profound vulnerability, both mother and daughter collapse at the altar and beg the goddess for mercy, for guidance, and for transformation. And what follows is a divine act of transfiguration. As they leave the temple, something begins to change. Iphis' stride lengthens, her voice deepens, her features sharpen, and by the time they reach home, Iphis has physically become male. The miracle is complete. The marriage proceeds without interruption. Ianthe is none the wiser. The city rejoices, the family is relieved, and in Ovid's words, the story ends on a happy note. The boy Iphis gained his own Ianthe. But is it really a happy ending? Christine Downing doesn't think so. In her 1994 article, I just mentioned, Lesbian Mythology, she argues that the myth of Iphis, do you know what? I might have been saying this wrong the whole time. Iphis, we'll go with Iphis, and Ianthe, though couched in the celebratory tones of divine blessing, reveals the pain of erasure and the desperation for mythic validation that so many queer people have experienced. From the ancient world's perspective, the story resolves well because it preserves heterosexual norms. Two girls fall in love, but since the love cannot be consummated within the constraints of a gender-binary society, the gods must intervene. And the only imaginable resolution is to change one of them into a man. And the lesbian desire is thus solved by transforming it into a straight relationship. And Downing poignantly observes that the myth recognises the reality and the depth of Iphis' love for Ianthe. It even confirms that the love is mutual, but it cannot acknowledge the possibility of two women loving each other in their own female bodies. The story expresses both the desire and the repression, the visibility and the erasure. And as Downing puts it, the desire is acknowledged, but not the possibility of fulfillment. And I'm going to put a link to this article by Downing into the show notes because it's really, it's such a good read. If you're interested in looking at mythology through a queer lens, this is what you want to be reading. And in more modern readings, the story of Iphis has also been interpreted through a trans-masculine lens. Raised as a boy, identifying as a boy, and eventually transformed into one, Iphis' experience resonates deeply with the stories of many transgender men. And from this perspective, the myth becomes a narrative of bodily alignment and affirmation, rather than sexual erasure. But these type of readings also have to contend with the fact that Iphis' transformation is not one that she really explicitly requests. It's more of a desperate prayer to resolve a societal conflict. It's not a personal declaration of gender identity. And Ovid frames a transformation as a necessity and not as a choice. But in either reading, lesbian or trans, the myth is powerful, precisely because it confronts a world without language or a precedent for queer existence. Iphis stands at the edge of mythological possibility, caught in a story that wants to include her, but can't quite make room for who she actually is. Her transformation is a divine intervention, yes, but it's also a metaphor for the violence that normative systems can do to queer love. If it cannot be allowed as is, it must be altered into something more palatable. And what makes the myth of Iphis and Ianthe so enduring, even across 2 millennia, is that it holds within it both the pain and the possibility of queer life. It's a myth of longing, of what happens when love dares not speak its name, and when the only solution is to become someone else entirely. It invites us to imagine another ending, one where Iphis and Ianthe could love one another freely in the bodies they were born into, with no transformation required. And until that myth is written, we return to Iphis, ancient, anguished, and deeply human, standing in a temple of Isis, asking the gods for a way to make love real in a world that refuses to see it. Okay, we're going to stay in Greece here again, and now we're going to talk about Artemis. So Artemis is the Greek goddess of the hunt, of the wilderness and the moon, and she's long stood as a potent symbol for lesbian readings of mythology. Her virginity has often been taken as asexuality or merely chaste in some classical interpretations, but it can also be viewed through a lesbian lens as a refusal of male possession, an active withdrawal from heteropatriarchal control. Artemis is not alone in her choice. She's always surrounded by nymphs, female companions bound to her in loyalty and mutual devotion. Can you hear that rain? That's a lot of rain. There you go, there's just a few seconds of rain. I probably should close the window, shouldn't I? Right, sorry about that. Window is now closed. But together, Artemis and her nymphs form a reclusive, all-female commune, often deep in forests and in mountains, liminal spaces in myths where conventional gender roles are kind of suspended or inverted. And rather than heterosexual absence, this female exclusivity opens a space for erotic autonomy. One of the most compelling mythic narratives that come out of this context is the story of Callisto, a nymph of Artemis who was famously expelled from the goddess's circle after she was discovered to be pregnant. And according again to Ovid's Metamorphosis, Callisto took a vow of chastity to remain close to Artemis, but Zeus, desiring her, disguised himself as Artemis to get close to her, and he assaulted her. In some versions, Callisto is unaware of the deception. In others, there is confusion and trauma, layered with guilt for breaking her vow. And when Artemis learns of Callisto's pregnancy, she banishes her, regardless of whether or not it was consensual. And eventually, Callisto is transformed into a bear, and later immortalised as a constellation. And from a lesbian feminist perspective, this story becomes really deeply symbolic. Callisto's desire to remain close to Artemis, her emotional and possible erotic bond with this goddess, and her willing renunciation of men point to a bit of a kind of proto-lesbian identity. Her violation by Zeus under the guise of Artemis herself is not just an act of violence, but it's also one of heteronormative intrusion into a queer space. Scholars like, again, Carolyn Downing and Sarah Boehringer interpret this as a metaphor for patriarchal culture's punishment of lesbian autonomy. Zeus doesn't just assault Callisto, he does so by impersonating her beloved, by inserting male dominance into a bond of female trust. This intrusion and its aftermath, banishment by Artemis, transformation into a beast, are interpreted by critics as illustrating how female desire, especially lesbian desire, is policed and punished in patriarchal myth, as Artemis represents a vision of erotic autonomy and matrifocal solidarity. Her rejection of Callisto, rather than being simple cruelty, symbolises how, even within women's communities, the stain of male violence disrupts closeness, breeding silence and exclusion. And there have been lots of reinterpretations of this myth through a queer lens. I did read a bit of a thesis by Amelia Hammerlink, and she's got one called She Still Sees Herself in Artemis, and that is available to read online. And in this thesis, Amelia reinterprets the myth through a queer lens and says, to see Artemis bathe is to see the divine in freedom. To see Callisto suffer is to see how that freedom is violently revoked by a world that cannot abide female self-determination. In this reading, Artemis and her nymphs offer a mythic prototype of lesbian separatism, a community structured not just by gender exclusion, but also by shared erotic, emotional and political alignment. Callisto's fall becomes a lesbian tragedy, her bond with Artemis ruptured by male violence and patriarchal control. And this type of interpretation resonates really strongly with how lesbian feminists in the 70s and 80s reappropriated Artemis's myth as a goddess of female empowerment. And Linda Hart in 1988 argued in her mythological study that Artemis isn't simply a virgin, but she's a figure of refusal of male gods, male rights and male myths. Artemis and her circle of nymphs have since become powerful archetypes in lesbian literature and neo-pagan spirituality, and also in queer retellings. They offer a mythic image of a lesbian utopia, one where desire is unspoken but deeply present, where nature itself shelters women who love, live, and resist together. In this way, the myth of Artemis and Callisto is not just a cautionary tale of divine wrath, but it's more of a coded narrative about the fragility and resilience of lesbian desire in a hostile world. The forest becomes a little bit of a sanctuary, really, and Artemis is at the head of this as the symbol of the refusal, and Callisto becomes a martyr of a patriarchal penetration. And together, they trace the arc of queer resistance embedded deep within mythic structures. And the myth is revealing. Callisto was Artemis's favourite. She was the most beautiful of all the nymphs, who thought that she was laying with the goddess that she adored. And this isn't just a story about betrayal, it's a tragedy of stolen lesbian love, a sanctuary of women shattered by male intrusion. Now, if you thought we were going to do this episode and not talk about Sappho, then you're wrong. And although Sappho is not a mythological figure as such, I still think it's a really important person to discuss in the context of this episode, especially since a lot of what I'm talking to you about today does come from Greece. And Sappho, she stands at this intersection of literature, sexuality, and mythology. Living around 630 BC on the Isle of Lesbos, she composed some of the most emotionally charged and erotically frank poetry the world has ever known. And though only fragments of her work survive, the voice that emerges is unmistakable. She is a woman who dared to speak in the first person about her love for other women in a society that had no category for such a thing. The survival of even those scraps is pretty impressive. Her poems have crossed oceans of time, wars, censorship, and religious condemnation, and they continue to speak with an intimacy and immediacy that feels astonishing even today. Sappho's world was that of archaic Greece, a period just before the classical Golden Age, where lyric poetry was just emerging as a new form of personal expression. Most poets of her time focused on heroic deeds, public exploits, or the praises of gods and warriors. But Sappho turned inward. Her subject was the self, her own desires, her own fears, jealousies, and passions. She lived in a culture where elite women often participated in ritual and artistic life, particularly in places like Lesbos, where they may have been educated and trained in musical and poetic arts. Some sources actually suggest that Sappho led a kind of female-centred religious or educational circle in which girls were taught to prepare for marriage through song, through dance and poetry. But these sort of domestic explanations for her world can feel a bit more like a retroactive justification. They're more like attempts to downplay the very obvious erotic energy in her verses. And what survives of Sappho's poetry contradicts any reduction of her to a mere instructor of young brides. She actually names her lovers and companions, depicting them in tones not of reverent distance, but of physical desire, intimacy, and an aching emotional immediacy. Her poems are filled with moments of touch, of gazes held too long, of longing that burns through the page. In fragment 16, she famously writes, "Some say cavalry, some say infantry, some say ships are the most beautiful thing on the black earth. I say it is what one loves." And what she loves, she goes on to make very clear, is not war or empire, but the face of a woman. She names her Anactoria. There is no metaphor here, no obfuscation, just pure devotion. And another really striking one of her works is perhaps fragment 31, and this is a poem of jealousy and physical unravelling. And here's the scenario that takes place in that poem, and I think it's one a lot of people can probably relate to a little bit. She's watching a beloved woman converse with a man. And in doing so, Sappho just sort of collapses inward. Her voice falters, her skin burns, her ears ring, her limbs fail her. And the poem captures in just 10 brief lines the full bodily force of erotic despair. and it's poetry as a sort of lived experience, and it speaks from a place of really authentic lesbian desire, not an allegory or a stand-in for male eroticism, but the real thing. And it's a scenario that I'm sure many women who have feelings for women have been in. You know, you have unrequited feelings for somebody, for another woman, and you're watching her talk to a man. How does that make you feel? And this is that in a nutshell. So I thought it's probably best that I read it to you, isn't it? So let's go. He seems to me equal to gods, that man, whoever he is, opposite you, sits and listens close to your sweet speaking and lovely laughing. Oh, it puts the heart in my chest on wings, for when I look at you, even a moment, no speaking is left in me. No tongue breaks, and thin fire is racing under skin, and in eyes no sight, and drumming fills ears, and cold sweat holds me, and shaking grips me all. Greener than grass I am, and dead, or almost, I seem to be. It's pretty powerful, and pretty dramatic, and I feel like I can speak for lesbians, being one of them. We are dramatic, and there ain't no love poem like a lesbian love poem. And the thing is about Sappho is that she writes not just about women, but she's writing to them and she's writing for them, and that it makes it really, really powerful. She does something unprecedented in literary history. She writes in the first person as a woman for herself, and she gives a central place to her own love. She's not just describing feelings, she's claiming their validity. And Downing writes that Sappho's I is the first voice to speak of the soul as known from within in the first person. Yet, despite, or maybe because of this power, Sappho's reception over time has been deeply fraught. In her own day, she was revered. Plato called her the 10th muse, and later Hellenistic and Roman writers praised her literary genius while growing increasingly uncomfortable with the implications of her sexuality. And how do you think they managed to try and course correct this? Well, myths began to appear to correct the historical record or alter the historical record. And there's one absolutely wild but very, very enduring legend that claimed Sappho leapt to her death from the cliffs out of unrequited love for a ferryman named Phaon. And this very heterosexual fantasy was likely invented to maybe neutralise the disruptive power of her legacy, and it transformed her from a poet of female desire into a tragic victim of heterosexual love. In the Christian Middle Ages, Sappho's poetry was almost entirely lost. Whether that's through negligence or targeted destruction, we don't know, but we can make an educated guess, guys. You know, think about everything that I've told you about the Middle Ages. When we get to pretty much any lady of law, we get to this period of time, and it's very much sort of like Tipp-Exing over things and reframing things from a Christian viewpoint. So yeah, her voice sort of disappeared, really, from the canon. And her voice once echoed through Athenian salons and Alexandrian libraries, but now was silenced. And only fragments survived, quoted by grammarians, scribbled down on pieces of parchment, preserved by chance in Egyptian mummification wrappings. And the few pieces that endured did so a bit like embers under ash, just waiting for someone to come along and spark them and ignite them again. And that spark came in modernity. And during the Renaissance, scholars began to rediscover Sappho, as they did with many other things during the Renaissance. And by the 19th century, we had this sort of rise of romanticism and maybe the first stirrings of sexual identity in politics. And this meant that Sappho made a bit of a return to cultural consciousness. But even then, she was still pretty misunderstood, or maybe even willfully misread. Victorian scholars argued that her love poetry was simply platonic, it was symbolic, it was anything but lesbian, essentially. And others suggested that she was merely praising feminine beauty in an acceptable artistic convention. You know, in the way that you say, like, I've got a girl crush, or I could kiss a girl, but I could never be with one. You know, we've all been there. And then we get round to the 20th century, and this is where Sappho was finally reclaimed by those whose lives mirrored her verse. As the concepts of homosexuality and lesbian identity began to form in the early 1900s, queer women found Sappho as a bit of a foremother and a myth. And the word lesbian itself derives from her home island. In a world where same-sex love was criminalised, medicalised and shamed, Sappho offered something revolutionary: a lineage. She gave women who loved women a language and a place in history. Early feminists and sapphic poets like Renee Vivienne invoked her spirit. Later speakers like Audre Lorde and Monique Wittig engaged with her legacy as a political and poetic foundation. And Sappho became not only a literary icon, but a cultural archetype, a mythical figure whose poetry sanctified love between women. And I said it before, but you might be thinking, why are you talking about someone who's not a mythological figure? Well, I'm going to tell you right now. Sappho's legacy resonated so deeply within the world of mythology and folklore. She was deified in antiquity. She was celebrated by poets and priests, and she was woven into the pantheon, not as a goddess, but as something maybe a little bit more potent, a mortal whose words could move gods. Her work is filled with references to Aphrodite, the goddess of love and desire, whom she addresses with a rare intimacy. In one surviving poem, Sappho pleads with Aphrodite not to let her heart be broken by an indifferent lover. The poem is a prayer, but it's also a dialogue between equals. Sappho does not tremble before the goddess. She bargains, she pleads, she questions. In mythological terms, Sappho becomes a priestess of Aphrodite, a vessel of divine eros, a human figure who channels sacred longing into song. Through her, the lines between myth and reality blur. She is both participant and creator of myth. And also, in many ways, Sappho has become a bit of a myth herself, because so much of her biography is lost and so little of her work remains intact that she exists in cultural memory as a composite of fact and legend. And myths endure not because they are precise. We know this very, very well. A lot of the people that we talk about have very fragmented history, but they endure because they are expressing something essential. And Sappho's myth speaks to the enduring presence of lesbian desire and the power of the female voice and the sanctity of self-expression. Even in fragments, she teaches us that love, queer love, unrepentant love, has always existed. Her poetry is not a footnote in the history of literature. It is its pulse. And today, Sappho's legacy is alive in countless ways. In the word lesbian itself, in queer literature and theory, in love poems written between women, in pride flags, in feminist manifestos. Her verses are tattooed on bodies, recited at weddings, chanted at protests, and a hashtag on TikTok quite a lot of the time. For many in the lesbian and queer communities, she's more than a poet. She is a symbol of survival, creativity, and the refusal to be silenced. Sappho's voice reaches across the abyss of time with a message that couldn't be more urgent, that the most radical act is to love without shame, to speak without disguise, and to make even a fragment of your truth into poetry. And I'll end this section by reading you one more little bit of Sappho, I hope you don't mind. And this is a poem dedicated to a woman who Sappho loved. And she believes that this love is the one thing that is the most important thing in the whole world. And love is the true driving force behind all of the decisions and direction of one's life. Some say cavalry corps. Some infantry. Some, again, will maintain that the swift oars of our fleet are the finest sight on dark earth. But I say that whatever one loves is. This is easily proved. Did not Helen, she who had scanned the flower of the world's manhood, choose as first among men one who laid Troy's honour in ruin, warped to his will, forgetting love due to her own blood, her own child? She wandered far with him. So, Anictoria, although you being far away forget us, the dear sound of your footstep and light glancing in your eyes would move me more than glitter of Lydian horse or armoured tread of mainland infantry. Right, well, we've spent a lot of time in Greece, and I'm not going to lie to you, we probably will be going back there in a bit. So I thought we would pop out for a bit. We'll go somewhere else. So we're going to go over to China now and look at the Golden Orchid Societies. Now, the Golden Orchid Societies were in the late Qing dynasty and early Republican phase of southern China, and they offer a really compelling blend of lived history and mythic imagination that often surrounds women who loved other women. Though rooted in real economic and social conditions, especially in the Guangdong province, where many men left for work abroad and women gained autonomy through the silk industry, the stories of these women have taken on a bit of a folkloric quality, and as official histories tried to ignore or erase them, they sort of slipped into the realm of memory, rumour and legend, where queer lives really often survive. So I thought it would just be really interesting to talk about something like this, and it's not something that I was aware of before. I did a lot of research for this episode, and it's something that really, I don't know, just stuck in my brain, and I just wanted to tell you all about it, so I hope that's okay. These societies were made up of women who rejected heterosexual marriage, either becoming what was called a self-combed woman or entering formal partnerships with other women. The self-combing ceremony itself bordered on ritualistic. It echoed the symbolic gestures found in mythological rites of passage. So in this ritual, a woman would comb her hair into a style usually just reserved for married women, publicly declaring her intention to remain unmarried and independent. And in doing so, she stepped out of the expected narrative of wifehood and into this liminal space. And that's a recurring theme in folklore, where heroines, witches and spirits often dwell on the edges of society. And some of these women formed lifelong romantic and domestic partnerships with each other. And these unions, called golden orchid bonds, could involve ceremonies of commitment, offerings to ancestors, and the exchange of vows. They're not simply pragmatic arrangements, they actually drew from a cultural logic of kinship and ritual that made them as legible as family. And there are oral histories and temple records that reveal that these partnerships were often understood and remembered not as transgressions, but as alternative ways of building kin, as mythic in their devotion as any tale of faithful wives or star-crossed lovers. And the literary and folklore echoes are pretty hard to miss. In the language of these unions, one partner might be called husband and the other wife. And this is reminiscent of the gender crossing or gender blurring that you see often in Chinese opera, where heroines dress as men and lovers are reunited in dreamlike, ambiguous spaces. The Chinese stage itself, especially in Cantonese opera, has long been a space where female performers played both romantic roles, sowing the seeds of queer possibility in public imagination. Some golden orchid couples even inspired local legends. And there's one story that tells of two women who pledged themselves to each other in secret, lived together in a silk-weaving household, and died within days of one another. And they were later said to have become guardian spirits of the workshop, watching over other working women who resisted marriage. And this overlap between the historical and the mythical is what makes the Golden Orchid women so resonant today. Though many of their names have been lost, their stories survive in ancestral halls, whispered temple records and local folklore. It's, again, half history, half legend, a bit like Sappho. As historian Susan Mann notes in her work Precious Records, they negotiated space within a system designed to exclude them, and sometimes succeeded in building whole parallel worlds. And these were not just acts of resistance, but acts of creation, forging new forms of kingship and desire, often through rituals that echoed the very mythology from which they had been culturally excluded. In a world where queer women are so often written out of the narrative, the Golden Orchid Societies offer something radical. Not just proof of existence, but a vision of a queer community that touches myth and memory alike. They are history, yes, but they're also a kind of folklore in motion, passed down through ritual, rumour, and the quiet endurance of love. I just thought that was really lovely, and I really wanted to tell you about it. So that was our little trip over to China. Before we go back to Greece, I just want to take you to one other place, and that is North America. Particularly, we're going to be looking at indigenous nations across North America. And among these nations, queerness, particularly as it relates to gender and sexuality, has long been understood in ways far more nuanced and inclusive than colonial Western frameworks allow. While the term lesbian is not traditionally used in these contexts, many indigenous cultures recognise and honour people who today might be described as queer women. These individuals often occupied spiritual, ceremonial and communal roles, and their identities are deeply embedded in both mythology and living oral tradition. And pretty central to many of these traditions is the concept of two-spirit identity, and this is a pan-Indigenous post-colonial term that emerged in the 1990s to describe people who embody both masculine and feminine spirits. Though often associated with those assigned male at birth, the term and the roles it describes also encompass individuals assigned female at birth who lived as, loved as, or moved fluidly between what settlers would call women and men. Some two-spirit individuals formed partnerships with other women, participated in women's societies, or took on gender roles not bound by binary definitions. And these ways of being were not aberrations, but deeply rooted in spiritual cosmologies and cultural practices. For example, among the Ojibwe people, stories speak of agokwe, individuals who took on gender expressions different from those assigned at birth. Though most colonial ethnographers fixated on male-assigned agokwe, some researchers suggest that there was existence of female-assigned individuals who lived and loved in ways considered masculine, including taking wives or assuming warrior roles. And these people were often seen as gifted. They were able to walk between worlds, and sometimes connected to sacred duties like medicine, midwifery, divination. In stories passed down through oral tradition, these figures are not portrayed as deviants, but as bearers of spiritual insight, figures whose difference allowed them to act as intermediaries between realms. In Navajo cosmology, the existence of multiple genders is woven directly into creation stories. They recognise 4 genders: feminine women, masculine man, masculine female-bodied person, and feminine male-bodied person. These identities are reflected in mythic beings and in the sacred balance of the world. Queer women, those who might be described as masculine female-bodied individuals or women who loved women, were part of this sacred structure. In traditional stories, the changing woman, one of the most powerful deities in this mythology, is said to possess both generative and autonomous power. And while she's not explicitly queer, her self-sufficiency and her role in creating life without a male partner resonate powerfully in queer feminist readings. Her myths are often invoked in discussions of sovereignty, not just political sovereignty, but also bodily, relational, and sexual. In Haudenosaunee and Lakota traditions, women who defied gender norms by becoming hunters or warriors or political leaders were sometimes the subject of clan legends. Some lived with or formed partnerships with other women, and their stories were passed down not as cautionary tales, but as examples of strength and differences. These women were said to possess 2 hearts or 2 visions, allowing them to hold multiple truths simultaneously. In some communities, this dual vision made them excellent diplomats, storytellers and spiritual leaders, roles all steeped in myth and ritual. And as we know, with the arrival of European colonisers and missionaries came a violent reordering of gender and sexual systems, and the stories of two-spirit and queer women were suppressed. They were erased from the record or reframed as deviants by Christian moral frameworks. But many of these traditions survived, encoded in oral histories and ceremonial dances and stories shared within families. For instance, in some contemporary indigenous storytelling, queer ancestors are remembered as tricksters, shapeshifters, or spirit walkers. Not just labels, but mythic figures with agency and resonance. As two-spirit scholar and writer Crowley Driscoll puts it, these figures exist not in spite of our traditions, but because of them. Even today, queer Indigenous women and two-spirit individuals are reclaiming and reweaving these mythologies into their own narratives. This reclamation is not just a return to the past, but it's a radical act of survivance. And this is a term coined by scholar Gerald Vizenor to describe survival beyond mere endurance, rooted in resistance, presence, and storytelling. By invoking ancestral roles, spiritual frameworks, and mythic lineages, queer Indigenous women position themselves not as outsiders, but as central to their culture's cosmological and historical worlds. So while settler colonial history has tried very hard to erase or flatten queer Indigenous identities, folklore and mythology preserve a completely different truth, one in which queer women were not marginal, they were sacred, not erased but remembered, and not alone but part of a constellation of spirits, stories and ancestors who moved between worlds with power and grace. Okay, we're going to go back to Greece now for the very last time, and we're going to talk about the Amazons and the Maenads, two of the most evocative and subversive figures in Greek mythology, and they've both been reclaimed in lesbian and feminist scholarship as potent symbols of female autonomy, erotic agency, and resistance to the patriarchy. From a lesbian perspective, these women are not simply characters in stories, but they're a representation of alternative ways of being, worlds where women live, fight, worship, and love far beyond the gaze or governance of men. The Amazons were traditionally described in Greek sources as fierce warrior women who lived apart from men, engaging with them only for the purpose of reproduction and only raising their daughters. They rejected the domestic roles assigned to Greek women and instead claimed independence, physical prowess, and political control over their communities. They also had a Wonder Woman. While Greek writers often portrayed them as monstrous or unnatural, figures that needed to be defeated or subdued by Greek male heroes, lesbian interpretations, especially in the 20th century, have viewed the Amazons as mythic predecessors to separatist, feminist, and lesbian cultures. Authors like Monique Wittig have drawn inspiration from Amazonian archetypes to imagine utopias of lesbian sisterhood and radical social restructuring. In this view, the Amazon is not an outcast or a threat, but a visionary, someone who refuses heterosexual contact and manufactures a different form of society. Maenads, on the other hand, are often represented as wild, ecstatic followers of Dionysus, engaged in frenzied rituals, dancing, and even acts of ritual violence. Unlike the martial order of the Amazons, the Maenads' power came from ecstatic worship, from spiritual possession, and the breaking of rational boundaries. The Greek myths often warned against their uncontrolled nature, such as in Euripides' The Bacchae, where Pentheus is torn apart by the Maenads, including his own mother. But from a lesbian or queer feminist perspective, the Maenads symbolise erotic liberation, transgression, and a bit of a mystical sisterhood which existed outside of the normative order. And I'm going to go back to Carolyn Downing's essay, Lesbian Mythology, because in that she notes that for ancient male writers, the Maenads' absence of men and release from domesticity made them dangerous. But for modern lesbian readers, that very release renders them inspirational. And this perspective draws upon the long-standing feminist impulse to reclaim female-centred myths. And it's been argued that figures like the Amazons and the Maenads are invested with lesbian feminist atavism, expressing the longing for a deep matrilineal past that resists erasure. And these type of interpretations seek not historical accuracy, but mythic truth. Maybe performative reality where myth becomes a space to explore what kinds of identities and communities are thinkable, desirable, and powerful. In modern queer scholarship, these figures aren't simply ancient relics, but they're living tropes, reinterpreted for political meaning. Lesbian feminists often turn to myth not just for representation, but for vision. They view the Amazons and the Maenads not just as metaphors, but as embodiments of lesbian erotic freedom, power, and the potential for world building outside of the heterosexual norm. Modern writers and scholars have continued to explore this dynamic. The Journal of Lesbian Studies has featured works such as Penrose Jr.'s The Appeal of the Amazons, which explains how the Amazon became a symbol of lesbian empowerment in modern feminist literature. And A. Pistone's Lesbian Nature is Amazon Culture argues that the mythic image of the Amazons gave shape to real-world lesbian separatist movements. And these scholars note that lesbian feminists have long used mythology not to retreat into fantasy, but to challenge cultural norms and reshape political possibilities. And Pistone actually wrote, and I really like this quote, "Mythological figures allowed lesbian feminists to imagine a world that de-centered male dominance and offered erotic and political freedom." So far from being relics of misogynistic fantasy, the Amazons and the Maenads have been reimagined as bold figures of female resistance and passion. From ecstatic rituals in the forest to feminist feminist? I was reading the word communes, and the word feminist at the same time. I'll try that again. From ecstatic rituals in the forest to feminist communes, their images continue to resonate in lesbian cultural memory and imagination, and their stories affirm the possibility of alternative worlds where women are warriors, lovers and leaders on their own terms. Now I'm going to take you to Serbia and broader South Slavic folklore to tell you the story of Bauk and Maria. And although this tale wasn't originally framed as a lesbian tale, it has become a pretty potent example of queer reinterpretation within folkloristics. I started that and I just didn't paste the word right. It just didn't come out of my mouth. Guys, I can't talk, okay? And I've started to just keep all these things in because people are commenting and saying that it's making them laugh. So I don't know. You can have all my slip-ups. What I meant to say was folkloristics. Told in oral tradition and occasionally preserved in early ethnographic collections, this tale revolves around themes of disguise, devotion, and romantic agency. And through a lesbian lens, it becomes a striking narrative of female same-sex love surviving in a patriarchal world by passing under the guise of heteronormativity. The story goes as follows. Maria is a young woman pressured by her family to marry, but she resists all suitors. And then comes a mysterious stranger named Bauk, a strong, silent and masculine person who impresses Maria and her family, and she agrees to marry him. What no one knows, though, is that Bauk is not a man, but a woman who has been living in a male disguise. The marriage takes place, and Maria and Bauk begin their life together. Their marriage is described in various retellings as affectionate and harmonious, with Bauk fulfilling the role of the husband, while Maria gently falls in love with her. Eventually, the truth comes out, either through an accidental discovery or jealous neighbours. The revelation causes public outcry and the community demands punishment. But Maria defies the crowd. She declares that she knows the truth and loves Bauk regardless. In some versions, the tale ends tragically, with the two women executed or separated by force. In others, they are exiled or escape into the wilderness to live freely. The tone and the ending often shift depending on the storyteller and region, reflecting the tension between social norms and individual resistance. This tale holds remarkable significance when it's read through a lesbian or queer feminist perspective. Bauk can be seen not only as a figure of cross-dressing or gender nonconformity, but also as a lesbian who must mask her identity to live openly with the woman that she loves. The disguise becomes both a shield and a metaphor for the invisibility of same-sex love in societies that outlaw it or marginalise it. The bond between Bauk and Maria, far from being accidental or deceptive, is presented as emotionally and physically fulfilling. Maria's unwavering love, even after the revelation of Bauk's true sex, is a powerful statement of devotion, transcending social norms about gender and sexuality. And the name Bauk itself adds mythic resonance to the story. In Slavic mythology, a Bauk is a kind of shadowy creature, often associated with fear or the unknown. The character of Bauk, by adopting this name, becomes a figure of both transgression and transformation. She haunts the margins of gender. She unsettles the binaries, and yet she becomes a very deeply human and tender figure through her love for Maria. Historically, tales like Bauk and Maria occupy a very ambiguous space. South Slavic folklore, like many global traditions, often used disguise and metamorphosis and taboo to navigate themes of same-sex desire without ever openly acknowledging them. Lesbian relationships were rarely named, but could be encoded in stories of sisterhood, disguise, or possession. These tales provided both camouflage and continuity for queer expression. Modern scholars and queer theorists have revisited these types of oral stories to uncover their subversive subtexts. I feel like this might be the worst one for me, just not being able to read my own writing. So from this interpretive viewpoint, Falk and Maria's story becomes a narrative of resistance, and it highlights how love between women, though often culturally suppressed, found ways to be told and remembered and felt no matter what. And it resonates with contemporary queer audiences, not because it was originally intended to be a lesbian tale, but because it articulates the emotional truths and constraints that have shaped lesbian history across cultures. So there you go, there are some stories of queer women from across different cultures and across time. I will say that I've barely scratched the surface. I have barely scratched the surface. There was so much that came up in my research, and I've just picked a few that I felt I wanted to talk about. But I would really encourage you, if you are interested in this, to do more of a deep dive. I do have some more stuff coming about this specific thing. I'm working with somebody at the moment to do some really interesting stuff. We're going to sit down and do some recording together later on this month, so watch this space, and some of that will be on Patreon as well. So I'm really excited to share that with you all. But for now, let's move on and have a little chat about how we are looking at lesbian and queer women in mythology in the modern day. Modern lesbian retellings of mythology and folklore have become a vibrant terrain of resistance, recovery, and radical imagination. These narratives do more than just update the old stories. They actually question the very architecture of mythic storytelling that has historically excluded, demonised, and erased queer women. Across genres, authors and scholars are rewriting myth to reflect lesbian subjectivity, erotic autonomy, and the complexity of female experience. And the result of this is really a growing body of literature that not only centres queer women, but redefines what mythology can be. And a central figure in this movement is Madeline Miller, whose novel Circe has been widely celebrated for its queer feminist reframing of Homeric myth. Although Circe's titular character has relationships with men, including Odysseus, Miller allows her goddess protagonist moments of deep emotional and physical connection with women, particularly the nymphs. In these relationships, female desire and solidarity become sites of power and resistance. Miller's earlier novel, The Song of Achilles, which emotionally wrecked me in so many ways, focused on male queer love, but it also quietly situates female figures like Briseis and Thetis as subversive agents whose love and rage exist outside of the hetero-patriarchal order. Miller's writing also doesn't tokenise queerness. Rather, it interrogates how mythology can be reclaimed as a form of ethical and erotic resistance. Her Circe is a figure who chooses exile, who forges her own story outside of the Olympian hierarchy, and whose erotic autonomy includes, though doesn't exclusively define, her connections to other women. Now, there are so many other queer retellings of myth that I could talk to you about, but you would be here all day. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to sort of rapid fire through a couple of them, and I'll put some links in the show notes so you can have a little look and check them out. But here are a few. So firstly, there's a bit of a cornerstone in this field, and it's called Kissing the Witch, written in 1997 by Emma Donoghue. And this is a collection of feminist fairy tale retellings in which heroines reclaim their stories by building relationships with other women. And these relationships are often erotic. And these stories collapse the distance between archetypes like the stepmother, the princess, and the witch, revealing lesbian desire not as intrusion, but as the narrative's emotional and political engine. And then you've got The Dark Wife by Sarah Diemer, and this offers a lesbian retelling of the Persephone myth in which Hades is reimagined as a powerful woman, and the descent to the underworld becomes a metaphor for queer awakening rather than victimhood. And this subversion of the myth reclaims one of antiquity's most violent heterosexual scripts and sort of rehashes it as a story of mutual love and self-discovery, which is really interesting. And I haven't read this book, but I've read quite a lot about it. I've read some reviews of it, and I think I'm going to bump that up to the top of my retellings TBR, because I have to have a separate one for mythology for this podcast. But in more like academic terms, this represents a queering of mythic trauma. So it's a feminist queer reframing of dissent, not as punishment, but as a personal emancipation. In South Asian contexts, you have this really rich infusion of cultural specificity to queer myth retellings. In Shikandi and Other Tales They Don't Tell You, Devdutt Patnaik compiles genderqueer and lesbian-coded narratives from Hindu mythology, such as Chudala, a woman who disguises herself as a man to instruct her husband, and Sikhandini, who transforms to fight a war and enter marriage. And these tales use divine and mythic transgression to articulate same-sex desire and gender fluidity without the burden of Western categorization. And this work, while sometimes subtle in its queerness, is actually kind of radical for situating lesbian experiences within an Indian metaphysical framework where the gods themselves cross gender lines. And I think it's really important if you're interested in this, if you're interested in learning about sort of queer retellings and rediscovering of myths, I think it's really important to learn about intersectionality, because it's so essential in understanding these myths to learn about and understand and appreciate intersectionality. Intersectionality, I think, is kind of essential in queer mythology because it gives us the ability to see the full complexity of how queerness exists and is expressed across different cultures and different identities and different historical contexts. And if you look at it without an intersectional lens, you sort of run the risk of flattening queer mythology into really narrow Western white understanding of queerness, and you erase a lot of the richness of it. You know, a lesbian love story in Greek mythology is not the same as one in, I don't know, Yoruba cosmology or Chinese folklore or indigenous tradition. Like, each exists in its own system of belief, its own system of power and history. Intersectionality, it really helps us honour these differences rather than impose this universal narrative that, let's be honest, centres Eurocentric, cisgender and class-privileged experiences. And some of these stories are not just about sexuality, they're not just about gender, they're about sovereignty, they're about survival. And a lot of these mythologies, you have to read them with attention to how colonisation, caste systems or religious reform movements really had such a big impact on shaping what kinds of stories were preserved or suppressed and what were reinterpreted. And intersectionality just highlights so much, and even more so highlights how the ways that queer women, especially women of colour, disabled women or trans women, they've often been not erased just once, but erased twice or even 3 times. And their stories might survive in fragments or being mistranslated or morally revised or culturally shamed. And when you look at these myths with a more intersectional approach, it does help you read between the lines. And you don't ask who is missing, you ask why are they missing? Why were they taken out of this myth? And what happens if we bring them back? And intersectionality it makes queer myth more truthful. If we're being real, if we're keeping it 100, you know? You can't just look at these things through a Western lens. It's especially not a white Western lens. It makes it so much more powerful, and it turns mythology not just into a space of fantasy or escape, but actually as a place of reclamation and a place of, telling stories that reflect real lives, very complicated and real lives of people who have always been here. They've always been there, even when the record tried to remove them. But that's me on my soapbox about intersectionality. But when I was doing a lot of the research and reading a lot of research articles and thesi, I don't know, a lot of those, and books and things and journals about this topic, intersectionality is so bloody important, okay? So please learn about it, because it's important. And I guarantee you, if you have friends who are people of colour, if you have friends who are queer or disabled or trans or, a combination of those things, you will understand them and help them so much just by taking the time to learn and appreciate intersectionality. That's me off my soapbox. Very sorry. Actually, I'm not sorry. I'm not sorry. In film and television, lesbian reinterpretations of myth and folklore are increasingly present. They're not quite as in the forefront as you see in literature, but they are there. And one of the most striking examples of this is the film Ammonite, directed by Francis Lee. And while this isn't a mythological film in the strictest sense, it is an imaginative historical fiction about the life of 19th century paleontologist Mary Anning. In Ammonite, the sea and fossils function as mythic symbols invoking feminine time, oceanic mystery and hidden histories. The central relationship between Anning and Charlotte Murchison is tender, sexual and deeply transgressive, embedded in a world of silences and stratified repression. Here, the narrative reshapes history as myth, giving queer women a space to exist where none was recorded. Because what is myth, after all, but an explanation for what was excluded from empirical time? In television, I'm gonna mention Winona Earp, and this stands out for its folkloric setting and the fully realised relationship between Waverly Earp and Nicole Hort. Drawing on the Western and supernatural folklore of the American frontier, Winona Earp centres a queer romance that is both normalised and essential to the narrative's emotional weight. The show's queerness is not just a plot twist or a subtext, it is fully textual. Waverly and Nicole's relationship reconfigures the cowboy and gunslinger mythos, replacing stoic male loners with emotionally intelligent, witty and brave women whose love story resists tragic tropes. This is where lesbian folklore becomes not just recovery, but revision, the creation of new archetypes. And then more recently, the 2022 animated series The Owl House by Dana Terrace has made significant strides in queering the folkloric imagination. Though it's geared towards a younger audience, the series draws heavily from European fantasy traditions. So you have witches and curses and magical realms, but it centres its story on Luz, a queer Latina protagonist, and her relationship with Amity, a witch. Their romance is sweet and narratively meaningful, eschewing tragic outcomes or tokenism. And the show builds a universe where queer identity isn't an exception, but again, it's an integral part of the magical order. This reframing of folklore from the perspective of queer youth offers not only representation, but a new mythic language in which girls love girls, not in spite of the magical world, but through it. And there are also notable efforts in visual arts and indie media. Something that I found that I really loved was Zanelle Moholy's photographic series, which she reinterprets ancestral African archetypes and ceremonies, but through the lens of black lesbian embodiment. By placing black queer women in regal, mythic poses, beaded and adorned and crowned, Moholy generates a powerful counter-mythology to both colonial and patriarchal iconographies. Similarly, artist and writer Trung Le Nguyen, The Magic Fish, explores fairy tales as emotional frameworks for queer self-discovery. Though its protagonist is a Vietnamese-American boy, the book's interwoven tales told through a mother who alters fairy tales for her son carries an intense awareness of how folklore encodes queer and feminist yearnings, including those of queer women in immigrant households. Intersectionality again. The intellectual stakes of these reimaginings lie in their dual function, reclamation and reinvention. By inserting lesbian relationships into mythic spaces, creators refuse to accept that heterosexuality is a narrative default. They show that queerness is not an aberration or an afterthought, it's a primary force in the human imagination, long suppressed by dominant ideologies. And mythology, once used to naturalise patriarchy and naturalise heterosexuality, becomes a weapon of subversion. And these works contribute to what scholars have theorised as the lesbian continuum, a space not just of sexual identity, but of emotional, creative, and political alignment across time and genre. Lesbian reimaginings of myth and folklore don't just fill in historical gaps, they actually kind of rewire the symbolic systems that once excluded them. And they ask, what happens when the hero isn't a man with a sword, but it's a woman and her lesbian desire? What if the witch isn't actually evil, but she's just a lover that's been exiled for who she loves? And what if the monstrous is not what threatens the village, but what threatens the patriarchy? And these kind of stories provide answers not just in metaphor, but in myth. Originally a label applied to us by others, lesbian has become a name for ourselves that many of us are proud to claim. But claiming it also means reclaiming our myths. Artemis, Sappho, the Amazons. They're not perfect mirrors, but they are shards of light. They remind us that love between women has always existed, even when it had to hide, even when it had to change, even when it had to whisper from between the lines of ancient poetry. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really hope you've enjoyed this episode. It's a bit of a long one. But I hope that you've enjoyed it. And if you have, please do consider following or subscribing on your favourite podcast platform. You can leave me a little comment if your platform allows you to do that. You can also go and follow me over on Blue Sky or TikTok, although there has been a fake TikTok made of me, and it has been messaging people. So if you are messaged by me on TikTok, it's not actually me. And if you've really, really enjoyed, you can head over to Patreon and you can subscribe over there. It is free to join the basic Patreon. This gives you access to the Discord server where we all have a lovely little chat. It isn't a massive space over there. It's not overwhelming. It's quite a nice little quiet and friendly space. If you do decide to sign up to one of the paid tiers, you have access to the book club, you have access to the Heroines of History series, of which I've released one episode so far on Cleopatra, but I have loads more to come. And you'd be supporting the podcast, so I would just appreciate that so much. But there's never any pressure on you to do that. I don't want to give you the hard sell on that. If you're interested, please do. If you're not, that is absolutely fine. Ladies of Law is not going anywhere. It's not going to change. I still put my everything into this every single fortnight now, not every week. As I said, there'll also be some links in the show notes to ways that you can help and support over in Los Angeles with the issues that are going on over there. But to wrap it up, it seems like it's only the right way to do it. I just wanted to say a big thank you to all of the wonderful, beautiful, amazing, talented, creative, smart, funny, gorgeous, queer people in my life. There are so many of you, and I love you all so very dearly. So thank you to Katie, thank you to Em, thank you to Hopi, thank you to Laurie, thank you to Lucy and Bev, thank you to Lauren and Aisha, thank you to Cloda, and a massive thank you to Ruby. Without you, I wouldn't be able to do this. I love you very, very much, and I'm so proud of you, and I'm so proud to have you in my life. And yeah, you amaze me every single day. If I haven't mentioned you, that doesn't mean that I don't think about you. I'm just very bad at remembering things on the spot, and I'm poorly. But I'll be back next week to unravel another thread in the rich tapestry of women in mythology and folklore.